What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Modern Goonies Cinema, where we analyze and review movies and TV. I'm your host, Trevor. So today, I want to talk about the recently canceled Netflix series from the same creators as Dark, which is 1899. Major spoilers ahead for 1899, and slight spoilers for Dark. So I've got to say that I am really excited to talk about this one. If you know anything about me, you know that Dark is one of, if not my favorite show of all time. I mean, I loved it so much that I incorporated Sic Mundus into my Full Metal Alchemist tattoo. And I also wear the Dark pendant around a lot because I'm a huge fucking nerd. Dark is a masterclass in mystery, complex storytelling, and the absolute gold standard as far as time travel stories go. So when I heard that the same people who created the masterpiece that is Dark were now showrunning a new mind-bending series, I was absolutely thrilled to see what they could accomplish. Seriously, after watching the mind-fucking complexity that is Dark, it's really difficult to imagine that you'd have any energy to tell another story for the rest of your life. Yet here it is, 1899, and I gotta say, they really did not disappoint. Netflix did that for them. But in all seriousness, I loved this series. 1899 is what happens when Westworld, Lost, Inception, and Dark all get mashed together in the best way possible. There's mystery, complex plot threads, mind-bending twists, deep philosophical ideals, and an unsettling tone that kind of dips the show a little bit into some horror aspects. But before I go any further, I want to make one thing pretty clear, and it's that if you haven't watched this show twice, you really should. There are so many little details in the show that make it nearly impossible to pick up on all of them on only one viewing. Some of the reviews of the show have said that it's a puzzle that doesn't make any sense, and admittedly, there are a lot of things that are very difficult to understand. But after I watched the show twice, nearly every question that I had suddenly became very clear. But if you've only watched it once, then I hope to be able to break down some aspects that had me confused on my first viewing. Alright, let's get started. From the get-go, 1899 establishes some aspects of the plot that are very engaging. It immediately establishes that our main protagonist is not necessarily a reliable narrator. We clearly see the discombobulated thoughts in Mora's mind. Images of her being dragged off to an insane asylum, and now that she's awake, she's having to reiterate personal details to herself, such as the date, her name, and assure herself that she's not insane. This automatically tells the audience that perspectives in this show are going to be a little bit skewed and a little bit warped, and that we really shouldn't take things at face value. I personally love when a story does this because it makes me want to analyze every single thing that's going on within a scene. And it really makes me appreciate the plot twists when they finally do arrive. So the show doesn't waste any time in establishing what the core mystery is. There's another large passenger ship called the Prometheus that's been lost at sea for 4 months. And it just so happens to be the mirror image and the sister ship of the current ship that we're on, which is the Kerberos. So there's this, and then there's the fact that all the other passengers on board seem to be hiding something. Because they all seem to be pretty afraid that the ship is going to be turned around and send them back to the lands in which they came from in the first place. And I really love the parallels to And Then There Were None, where each of the main characters receives a letter from an unknown sender, and a lot of them having committed some kind of crime in their past that they are hiding from the world. So when you're introduced to the other passengers on board, this is where the show does something that I think is insanely creative and very unique. And it's that all of these characters are speaking totally different languages. The passengers have a very difficult time understanding one another, and often don't at all, because there really is no common tongue amongst them. English seems to be the closest one, but only a few characters speak it fluently, and the others can kind of just understand a few basic words, if any. There are some characters that speak multiple languages, but they really are in the minority. So the sense of uneasiness in the show is really only amplified by this fact, because when things eventually go off the rails, the characters aren't able to be as collaborative as necessary for survival. Not only are these strange occurrences difficult to explain on their own, but since everyone is speaking a different language, it makes it completely unfathomable to people who don't understand what Laura's saying in the literal sense. So this was something that I really enjoyed, and that means a lot coming from me because I've always been a dub guy. I watch anime dubbed, I watch foreign films dubbed, and I even watch Dark dubbed. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, but fuck off. But I didn't watch this show dubbed because I saw that a core piece of the intended narrative would be lost if I did that. The characters aren't supposed to understand each other. They're constantly speaking their mother tongues, which is something that you, the audience, would do as well. The dubbed version of this show would have just had everyone speaking English and then left me really confused as to why people aren't really understanding each other or acknowledging each other in the correct, social sense. Though on my second watch, I did try a few scenes in the dub, and I realized that it actually changes the entire dialogue of a scene. So I was watching this one scene where Angel is talking talking to Crester, and I noticed that in the dub, they actually understand each other. Crester says that he's looking for his sister, and then the two talk for a moment. But in the original, when you watch that scene, Crester says that he's looking for his little sister, to which Angel replies, "I have no idea what you're saying." So those are two drastically different ways to do a scene, and I think it really shows that you're not supposed to watch the dub for this series. But anyways, this idea was so creative that it turned me against a lifelong practice just for the sake of viewing, and I think that is a huge win for the show. However, while this idea was really engaging, there was one drawback to having such a large cast of characters, and it's that they don't all get the screen time necessary for me to develop a strong connection with all of them. Each of them have a traumatic moment in their past that we get to witness, but we don't get to see the background on all of them, which leaves a lot to be desired. For instance, I was actually really interested to see the events of Angel and Ramiro's past, but it was never shown to us, and we instead look at some less interesting characters like Jerome and Lushan. Not to mention that we're left in the dark on some really other mysterious and fascinating characters like Mrs. Wilson. So because of this, I'm really only left super invested in the characters that are linked to Mora in one way or another. Daniel, Elliot, and Henry, for example, because they all help really drive the plot forward, and most of them are pretty fleshed out enough for me to really care about their goals. The only other character that I find myself genuinely interested in who gets enough screen time to really make a difference is the captain. He's got a tragic backstory like the rest, but it's framed in a way that shows that it really helps drive his decision making. He's a driving force for several events in the plot, so it's really easy to care about his actions and progression as a character. So speaking of the characters, there's this plot device that they use in this show, but they also use in Dark that I really enjoy, and it's that they introduce these characters with such mystery or in such an ominous way that they make you believe they'll be an antagonist in one way or another, but they completely flip the script at a certain point, and now you're eagerly rooting for them. This concept is used on the Captain, Elliot, and Daniel. All characters that you're very put off by at first because of their creepy nature, only for them to become vital viewpoint characters as the story progresses. It also naturally makes you want to do a rewatch of the show, now understanding the motivations behind these characters as they do these seemingly ominous things, which we now know serve an important purpose. I also love how this show turns all of the characters against each other at the very beginning, only for them to heavily rely on and even sacrifice themselves for one another by the very end, showing that they're all capable of putting aside their differences and allowing their humanity to show through in times of peril and crisis. And this is something that's actually made kind of heartbreaking when you realize that this has happened time and time again. In the end, practically all of these characters will always come together to help one another. So, moving on to the mystery. I absolutely love the missing and abandoned ship plotline. It doesn't take much to realize that the Prometheus is the future version of the Kerberos, and while you don't really know that for certain in the beginning, it's all but cemented once Elliot is found locked in the cabinet on the Kerberos in the same exact way he was found on the Prometheus. The only question is, how does the Kerberos end up in the same place? This is something that's very enthralling to see play out, and I love just how eerie that idea is, being on this ship that housed thousands of people who have all vanished into thin air. But since we know this isn't the mystery the entire time, this leads directly into talking about the simulation. And I'll be honest, I really wasn't sure how I felt about this at first. You know that it's probably heading in this direction because by the end of the second episode, you're shown the main characters through TV screens on a wall. But at that point, nothing had really been concrete, so you really could have just chalked it up to a stylistic way to end the episode. After all, these showrunners are known for their flair, especially when it comes to ending sequences in their series, as both this show and Dark end each episode with some kind of music score that fits the tone of that entire episode. However, as things play out, it becomes abundantly clear that we are, in fact, in a simulation. And with this reveal, the mystery takes a dramatic shift away from the ghost ship and now onto what this simulation is, why people are there, and who/what is actually real. I was a little disappointed that we wouldn't be focusing on the initial mystery that is the Prometheus, and I did groan a little bit at the idea of it all being a simulation, mainly because that trope feels really tired at this point. And with these type of reveals typically comes this cheapening of everything that we've learned and established so far. It was all a simulation has basically just become the modern day version of it was all a dream. However, I think they pulled this off impressively well. For the entirety of the show, everything that you know about these characters is under the constant veil of ambiguity. Characters are constantly lying, withholding information, and even questioning their own reality. We really aren't given anything concrete to latch onto, so who they are is just as malleable as what we actually know. So nothing is really taken away whenever it's it's revealed that everything we've known so far is really just a simulation. Plus, with this reveal, it opens the door to much more mystery and complexity than a ghost ship time loop ever could. Once the rug is pulled out from under us, we aren't just left with, oh, it's all a simulation, nothing matters. We're instead left to cope and adjust with all of the ramifications that come with this very idea. If this is all a simulation, then why are we all here? Why is everything looping back on itself? Did Mora really create all of this? And if so, why does she want to forget so bad? There really is a lot more to be learned and desired, which I think is probably the most creative way to turn a cheap twist into something very intricate and profound. So let's move on to how the simulation works. The mechanics of the simulation are still pretty ambiguous, but we do know that everything is looping back on itself within an 8-day cycle, and that there are a few characters that are trying to stop this process from happening, while there are some other characters who want aspects of this to continue indefinitely, which is a plot thread that is very reminiscent of Dark, with parallels of Adam, who wants a time loop to end, and Eve, who wants a time loop to continue. Henry is this story's stand-in for Eve, constantly trying to obtain a key from Mora, and then giving her a syringe to make her forget everything and allowing the simulation loop to start over again. And then Daniel and Elliot are this story's stand-in for Adam, doing all that they can to make Mora remember who she is, so that she can wake up before the simulation has a chance to start over. And it's in these characters that I find the story the most fascinating, because they all seem to be outside the bounds of the simulation itself. Henry states a few times that he's trapped in the simulation as much as anyone else, but he seems to have admin permissions on the world. While he might be in the simulation itself, he's not on the ships with the rest of the passengers, and he's instead in his own realm, keeping a watchful eye on everyone, and even manipulating the course of some events. He also keeps his memory, something that none of the other passengers are able to do on each cycle. Daniel and Elliot are like the net runners of this world. They may be stuck in the simulation, but they're able to manipulate some of the rules to their advantage. Essentially, they're finding exploits in the simulation's code and using it to try to find some kind of backdoor out of the loop. They use a green bug that unlocks doors and gateways, and they use this keyboard device to alter the code of some of the objects within the simulation, where they can adjust functions, locations, and even deactivate some other passengers. And they also keep their memories, having gone through this simulation dozens of times, each iteration learning something new that they can exploit in the next cycle, which is again another plot thread that's been plucked straight from Dark, where the time travelers altered the state of events slightly in each loop, so that eventually they would be able to break it whenever they had enough information. It's kind of like dying multiple times within a video game level. You might keep failing, but each time you respawn, you know something new about how to navigate the world and eventually beat the level. But this just leaves me wondering, why are these characters, also including the first mate, able to move so freely within the simulation? I've seen some theories that people are saying it's because all of these characters are dead, which if nothing else makes sense for Elliot, because it was heavily implied that he was on the verge of death, so Mora just uploaded his consciousness into the simulation. But for the others, I'm not so sure. Daniel also seems like he could be dead because of the way he says goodbye to Mora, but it can also just be something as simple as Daniel, being a co-creator, knows all of the exploits that he can use. But we really just don't have enough information to come to any kind of definitive conclusion on these characters. But no matter the answer, it's still a very interesting concept. So now I want to talk about some of the more ambiguous aspects of the mechanics of the simulation. And it's funny because I wrote out this whole section on logistical errors of the simulation, but after my second watch of the show, I found my answer to nearly every question that I had. So I'm going to run through some of the questions that I had on my first watch, and then reveal to you what I found the answer to be on my second. So one of the things that I was initially kind of confused on was why Henry was still trapped in the world if the simulation had happened time and time again. If Daniel and Elliot lost every single time, why hasn't Henry woken up from the simulation at all? Like, what was up with that? So the answer is that Henry keeps trying to get his hands on the key that Mora possesses, but he's failed on each loop because Mora never remembers where she puts the key. He also needs the pyramid that Elliot has, but Elliot keeps evading capture on each loop. So at the very end of the show, when we see Henry obtain both the pyramid and the key, this is actually the first time that he's been successful in this matter, because not everything in the loop has happened the same exact way, and things actually change from cycle to cycle. This isn't like Dark, where everything is doomed to happen the same exact way over and over again for eternity. And that's kind of how I thought of it when I first saw it, because I guess Dark just kind of geared my mind that way anyways, but it's actually not the case. It really is like a video game level. So another thing I was confused about was, since Daniel and Elliot have been through the simulation simulation so many times, why didn't they know where the key was, and why couldn't they just go straight to Mora with the pyramid and have her unlock it? And the answer to this is that they don't actually know where the key is. On each simulation cycle, they fail to get Mora to remember where she puts the key. So when we see her pull the key from the locket, this is actually the first time that Daniel is seeing where the key is. And that's because this is the first time that Daniel and Mora have been able to connect long enough for her to remember where it is without being totally freaked out and utterly confused. So the next thing I was confused about was, why did Daniel and Elliot seem to participate in some of the events of the simulation? For instance, Elliot refuses to speak to Mora for several episodes and uses the excuse that someone is watching them as a reason for not talking directly to her. And so I was a little confused why he couldn't just come out and say what he needed to say, and why all of the stuff had to happen in between. And the answer to that is that Daniel and Elliot can't just speak directly to Mora about all this stuff, because in doing so, it makes her very confused and hysterical even. She's currently got the mind of a 19th century woman. She's not equipped to understand the complexities that come with a simulation without being eased into it in some way. We see an example of this whenever Daniel uses his keyboard device to teleport the captain away. When Mora sees this, she completely loses her mind and forces Daniel into a locked room at gunpoint. Because with all of the strange shit that's going on, she naturally comes to the conclusion that Daniel is a part of it in some way, because she just witnessed him do something absolutely insane in front of her. We also can't forget that at the very beginning of the show, Mora receives a letter in an envelope that explicitly tells her not to trust anyone. And she thinks this letter has come from her own flesh and blood brother, so it's just not gonna work for anyone else that comes along asking Mora to trust them. So this is one of the reasons why they can't just outright tell her what's going on. And it's also part of the reason why they fuck around so much with the simulation. They're doing a lot of this to jog her memory without coming across totally insane. They're attempting to show her the shadows on the wall of her reality, a concept from the Plato's Cave allegory that she's obsessed with in real life. And then there's Daniel's murder spree. Sometimes, like in self-defense with the coworker, it's kind of necessary, but other times, like with Ada, the little girl, it just doesn't seem that way at all. And so by the end of my first watch, I was really confused to why he would kill an innocent little girl. And on my second watch, I realized that he kills all of these people because he's triggering the mutiny that occurs. For instance, let's take a look at one of the nightmare sequences from the captain. When you watch the captain's nightmare sequence, it comes to an end with the house burning, but instead of waking up in a new location like he should, he instead wakes up where that nightmare would have ended, in a burned house with all of the NPCs now absent from the world. He then follows Daniel's green bug out of the passageway and becomes totally aware of its existence, something that doesn't happen for any of the other characters except for Mora. Daniel purposely places the captain back into his nightmare so that he becomes aware of the passageway, something that becomes the final straw for the captain to make the decision to tow the Prometheus back to the shipping company, which is something that enrages everyone on board. Now combine that with Daniel killing a bunch of other passengers along with Ada, just this poor little girl, amongst an already mistreated lower class, and now we have the perfect recipe for a mutiny to occur. An insane and drunken captain hell-bent on turning a ship around that's carrying several passengers whose lives will be utterly destroyed if they return back home. And he also seems to have very little regard for the lives of these passengers, because he refuses to sink this ghost ship that everyone on board is convinced is killing everyone. And it's this mutiny that doesn't really seem to be something that's part of the plan for Henry and the first mate, the latter of whom looks very uneasy when the captain makes his decision to turn the ship around. He gives this look like he doesn't really have any idea what's going on, which makes sense because he later breaks character and protocol when the mutiny really spirals out of control. Now, why is the mutiny necessary for Daniel's plan to work? That really remains to be seen. But either way, it seems to have been a very calculated move on his part, having been through the simulation so many times. But also, one thing I really need to point out is that him killing all of these people is really of no consequence within the simulation. Since we know that everyone in the simulation is going to die anyways, and it's just going to restart with everyone alive, it really doesn't matter if he killed everyone on board, because it's all just going to happen again. So while it might look really fucked up that he deactivates this little girl, that's essentially all he's doing. He's just taking her out of this level where she'll return for the next. So that kind of brings an end to some of the questions that I had on my first watch, and this now leads me into some of the more ambiguous things that aren't really explored fully by the end. So one of the things that I'm still pretty unsure about is what the base simulation actually is. Since from the start we have these other characters manipulating the course of events, it's kind of hard to tell which events are the ones that constantly happen no matter what. It seems that everyone dying will always happen, along with Mora always being reset by Henry, but other than that, I'm really not sure. Was the simulation even supposed to go off the rails in the first place? Or was it supposed to be a relatively normal period piece that just constantly gets turned nightmarish due to everyone always fucking around with the coding? There is one scene that kind of implies that the simulation was a lot different before it got hijacked, and you see that in Daniel's memory of being in bed with Mora. They spend a few moments together, and it's when Mora leaves the room that you hear a voice say that a shutdown has been initiated. Daniel then steps outside into the same realm that Henry is later stationed in, which is outside the giant pyramid. And if you didn't catch it and you were wondering what's inside that giant pyramid, it is Daniel's and Mora's room. So this seems to imply that both Daniel and Mora were inside of the simulation, yet still outside the bounds of it, kind of like Henry is. Since we know that this entire thing is taking place on a spacecraft, could this have been the initial simulation that was designed to make the passengers more comfortable on their journey, with just having Daniel and Mora residing in that pyramid as the creators and overseers? There's also the nature of the doorways to the characters' memories. All of the characters experience their tragic past in these doorways, only to be woken back up in their room, not realizing that they had actually been in a totally separate realm just a few moments ago. Whoever is in charge of the simulation at this point seems to want to haunt these passengers with these memories. But are these passengers supposed to find these passageways on their own? It doesn't really seem like it. For instance, when Elliot shows Mora her gateway, Daniel actually gets pretty upset by it, telling Elliot, "You shouldn't have done that." The only other character that finds their own doorway is the captain, by the planning of Daniel. All the other passengers seem to only visit their realms whenever the simulation dictates. But no matter how much we see them, the nature of these doorways are left pretty ambiguous by the end of the season. Maybe these little moments would have been explored a little bit more in the later seasons, much in the same way that the first season of Dark gets recontextualized upon watching the second season, and even more so upon watching the third. But since we are currently not getting any more seasons of 1899, these issues are gonna have to remain as a slight con for the series, since these are questions that demand answers, and there isn't enough information for us to come to a conclusion on our own. So now I want to move on to this concept of the 70s to 80s era. This time frame keeps popping up in the show, and it's something that I find really fascinating, actually. We know by the end of the show that the alleged actual date is 2099, and this actually served its own smaller twist that I really wasn't expecting. Because in the moments of the show where we see the room that Henry is stationed in, all of the technology around him looks like it's from the 1980s at the very latest. And in Daniel's memory of being in bed with Mora, the room around him looks very reminiscent of the 70s. And then there's all the music that plays out the end of each episode. All of the songs on the endings were released anywhere from the late 60s to the early 80s. So when Mora actually woke up in the distant future, it actually really threw me off. Based on everything that we had been shown, I was fully expecting her to wake up in the 70s or the 80s. But while the real date might actually be in the distant future, this 70s to 80s era seems to hold some kind of significance to the story. Another example is when Mora wakes up and she reads the information that's on the computer screen. The computer itself is in a terminal style, which is something that you would more commonly see in the 80s, and you wouldn't really expect to see that kind of technology on a super advanced spacecraft. Also, when the computer screen details the amount of passengers and crew, if you add those numbers together, it comes out to be 1973. I want to shout out to Pete Peppers for pointing that out in one of his videos, because I did not think to do that. So I'm not really sure what the focus on this era is implying, but it creates its own little mystery that I really find fascinating. One of the major themes of the show is that reality is just what we choose to see around us. So I don't really think it's a stretch to believe that the 2099 reality is probably just another layer of the simulation. So my own theory that I like a lot is that this 2099 reality that we're seeing is actually just what the creators in the 70s to 80s thought that 2099 would look like. Is that actually what's going on? Probably not, but I really like the idea that the actual reality is somewhere in that 70s to 80s time frame. So one other thing that I liked about all these different eras popping up is is what they do with the character of Daniel. He's very anachronistic in the year 1899, and he doesn't really do much to hide it. The second you look at him, you notice that he has a totally different style from all of the other Victorian passengers. He also has technology that he definitely should not, casually whipping out a flashlight in a couple of scenes. And he was so nonchalant about this that I actually didn't notice it the first time that he did it. I actually wasn't even aware of it until the coworker explicitly pointed out that he didn't know what that device was. And that's where I was like, oh, shit. That doesn't exist yet. I really liked that aspect because this kind of shit starts to happen before it ever explicitly tells you that everything is a simulation. It might not come right out and say it, but it's being far from subtle, letting you know that things are definitely out of place. It's just up to you to kind of figure out what's going on. So one of the last main things that I want to discuss is the character of Maura herself. She's a very unique protagonist in the fact that by the end of an entire season, we still don't really know who she is. The version of her that we're most familiar with is this blank slate Maura, where she doesn't remember anything about her life outside of the simulation, and attempts to uncover the mystery of the Kerberos as genuinely as she possibly can. To us, she seems like a decent, caring person. However, we're constantly told things about her through other characters that make her a lot less sympathetic. Henry tells us about how she trapped her son's consciousness in the simulation, and then makes herself forget everything that she knows so she doesn't have to remember the pain. And he also tells us that she's the creator of the simulation, and that she is the sole reason that everyone is trapped within it. But then we have Daniel saying that while she might be the creator, it was her brother who hijacked it and trapped everyone inside. All the while, Maura has quick flashes of moments in her past, but she never fully remembers any of the things that the other characters are insisting is true. When she looks at Elliot and Daniel, she doesn't even feel a slight connection to them. They seem familiar, but that's about as far as it goes. The person she actually seems to be the most drawn to is the captain. There's a clear bond that the two share that Maura doesn't really share with any of the other characters, even Daniel. And then there's the added confusion of Daniel bringing up the concept of false memories, implying that a lot of the memories that this blank slate Maura has might not even be real, which sets a precedent that we really have no way of knowing the truth about Maura, or really anyone with any of the information that we've been given. So by the end of the show, we really don't know if Maura is someone that we should actually root for or not. A twist could come at any moment in the story where Maura is actually the villain, and all of the groundwork would have already been laid. We just have no way of knowing which characters, if any, are actually being truthful, which directly affects our perception of Maura. I said it at the beginning, but I really like how we can't even trust the main protagonist of the show. While she might not be lying like the other characters might be, her amnesia is its own form of lying by omission. If we come to not side with Maura, it's not through any purposely deceptive action on her part, but instead what she may have done in her past that may be unforgivable, even to this new version of herself. It's a very interesting way to frame a character, and I absolutely love it. So in conclusion, I really enjoyed 1899. It holds its very own distinct tone and complexity that really no other show accomplishes, much in the same way that Dark managed to. A little oxymoronic, I know. The showrunners once again take a really common sci-fi trope and make the audience grapple with the ramifications that come with these theoretical ideas that we often love to see in media. Instead of being another generic simulation story, it shifts its focus to what do you do when you're in a crumbling simulation but you don't have all of the information necessary to break out of it. The characters are very interesting and just as mysterious as the chain of events themselves. And the mystery is constantly shifting in a way that always leaves the audience with something new to unravel, without ever feeling like it's jumped the shark, which is a very difficult line to walk. I still don't think that the show is as good as Dark, but I definitely think that it's a very worthy follow-up. And it proves that these showrunners are some of the most creative and brilliant writers in this entire industry. And what I really appreciate about their writing style is that they don't infantilize their audience. Everything we need to solve their mysteries has already been laid out for us. We just need the story to progress to understand the context of the things that we've already been shown. They trust that we are intelligent, so they don't bog us down with a bunch of exposition. So it's extremely disappointing that Netflix canceled this show barely 2 months after its release. The show was released within the same week as its popular hit Wednesday, which only served to cannibalize viewers and never really give 1899 the time it needed to develop an audience. This show is never going to have the same kind of viewership as something like Wednesday, and Netflix should have already known this based on what happened with Dark. Dark is probably the best show that Netflix has ever put out. It's absolute top tier, but it's not a show that has wide audience appeal. It's extremely complex complex, thought-provoking, and foreign, which foreign alone is already going to alienate a lot of American viewers. It's not a show where you come home from work, turn off your brain, and vegetate in front of the TV. But just because Dark isn't a household name doesn't mean that it's not a masterpiece. And this very idea was something that Netflix used to pride themselves on, allowing artists total creative freedom and giving them opportunities that they would otherwise never get in a major studio, which has resulted in some of the best media in existence. And 1899 has everything going for it that Dark did. And the additional 2 seasons that were planned probably would have allowed 1899 to develop its own simulation theory masterpiece. There are so many questions left unanswered, so it's really a bit of a travesty that we were left on such a cliffhanger, potentially never to know what the creators had in mind. There have been a lot of people in uproar about this. Like, when I wrote the script for this episode, there were already like 80,000 signatures on a petition online, so I guess it's always possible that Netflix could change their minds due to audience demand. It's even possible that the show could be picked up by another streaming service. I feel like that could be pretty likely. These showrunners have proven themselves as extremely brilliant, and I don't think that can go totally unnoticed in this industry. They have more than proved themselves as capable writers, and I think any other service would be very lucky to have them. Either way, if this really is the end, then I think it's a huge blow. This could have been something really great, so it's going to be very missed, especially by me. There is a whole lot more to this show than what I covered. If I did a full-on breakdown, I'd be talking about every single little detail for hours on end. So go watch for yourself if you've somehow clicked this video without doing so. And if you've already seen it, go and give it a second watch to notice all of the little details that were put in, which is what I did, and it was a lot of fun. Well, that about wraps up my thoughts on 1899. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.